Imagine a winter town buried under layers of silent snow, where one wounded dog and one broken man found each other at the edge of a frozen forest. What began as a routine patrol turned into a miracle of trust and redemption, when a German shepherd once left for dead chose to save a child instead of fearing the world that hurt him. This is the true power of second chances, and the quiet courage of those who refuse to give up. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you are watching from, and if this story finds you in a moment when you needed hope. And please remember to press subscribe to support the channel so we can continue bringing these stories of faith and healing to your screen. Ashen Hollow, Montana, spent its winters wrapped in white the way old people wrapped themselves in quilts, tightly, stubbornly, as if refusing to let go. By late January, the town was a collection of steep roofs buried under snowdrifts, chimneys breathing thin trails of smoke into a sky the color of bruised porcelain. The two-lane road that cut past the last houses and into the pine forest had been plowed so many times it was now a narrow, shiny corridor of packed ice, flanked by walls of snow higher than a pickup's hood. The wind came down from the ridgeline in long, low currents, skating through the black branches of the pines until they whispered like a congregation sharing secrets. Ethan Ward drove that road, as if it were a line he had walked 1,000 times in his sleep. At 39, he had the build of a man who used to be carved out of stone and had spent the last few years slowly turning into something softer at the edges. Broad shoulders that slouched when he forgot to straighten them, a chest that still looked solid under his patrol jacket, and hands large enough to wrap around someone's wrist and make them reconsider a bad decision. His dark hair was cut short in the regulation style, but a persistent curl at the front refused to lie flat, and a faint silver streak had started to show near his temples, as if winter had touched him personally. There was a small scar along his left jaw, pale against his lightly tanned skin, the kind of mark that looked like it came from something sharp and fast, and he had the permanent half-moon shadows under his gray eyes of a man who woke up too often at 3 a.m, remembering things he did not talk about. Years before, Ethan had been a military police sergeant, the kind of person who walked into chaos and started putting it in order out of sheer stubbornness. The war had left him with medals he kept in a shoebox and memories he kept in locked drawers inside his head. The official diagnosis said post-traumatic stress disorder. Ethan translated it as too many ghosts and not enough room. On good days, the ghosts sat quietly. On bad days, they knocked on the walls. The patrol car's heater hissed, pushing barely warm air toward his boots. A travel mug of bitter coffee rattled in the cup holder each time the tires hit a rut. Ethan drove with his jaw set, one hand on the wheel, the other resting where his holster tugged at his belt. Ashen Hollow was small enough that he knew most houses by the shape of their roofs, and most residents by the kind of tracks their tires left after a storm. Out here, at the edge of the forest, there were no houses, just the long, dark silhouettes of pines and the occasional wooden sign half buried in snow, warning about icy curves. The radio at his shoulder crackled softly with the background hum of the county dispatch channel. Then a familiar voice cut in, low and steady. "Unit 3, status check," came the voice of Marla Hayes, the afternoon dispatcher. Marla was in her early 50s, a compact woman with short salt and pepper hair, and the kind of calm, smoky voice that made even traffic stops sound like bedtime stories. Years of listening to other people's emergencies had carved lines around her mouth that deepened when she smiled, which she did more often than people expected. "Unit 3, Code 4, Ethan replied, glancing into the rearview mirror at the empty road behind him. "Just making the loop out by the Hollow Ridge turnoff. Snow's slick but quiet." "Copy that," Marla said. "Try not to find any trouble. We're low on coffee and good moods today." A corner of Ethan's mouth twitched. "I'll keep trouble on a leash," he said, then let the radio fall quiet. The joke sat between them in the static, thin but real. The wind picked up, blowing powdery snow across the road in ghostly ribbons. As he rounded a gentle bend near a small clearing, where hunters sometimes parked their trucks in autumn, something on the right side of the road snagged his peripheral vision. A pattern in the snow that didn't belong to the simple geometry of tire tracks and plow scrapes. Ethan touched the brakes gently and eased the patrol car to the shoulder, the tires crunching into the icy ridge. He turned off the siren lights but left the engine running, the exhaust puffing slow clouds into the frigid air, then stepped out into the kind of cold that bit cleanly through the layers of his uniform and went straight for the bones. The world outside was muffled, as if wrapped in cotton. His breath formed small clouds, and each exhale sounded a little louder in the silence. On the snowbank, he had seen them, a series of tracks that hugged the edge of the trees. At first glance, they might have been human, but the spacing was wrong. Closer up, Ethan saw the story laid out in the white. There were boot prints, deep and uneven, as if the person had been dragging something heavy. Next to them, a messy trail of paw prints, the grooves of something being pulled, and long, chaotic scuffs where weight had fought gravity. He frowned, the muscles at the back of his neck tightening. Animals died in winter. That was part of the season's cruelty. But this had the sharp, ugly edges of human involvement. He keyed the radio, his voice tightening by a fraction. "Dispatch, Unit 3. "Go ahead, 3, Marla answered. "I'm stopping just off County Road 7 by the Hollow Ridge clearing. I've got drag marks and animal prints leading into the trees. I'm going to check it out on foot. Please log my location. No backup requested yet." "Copy. Logging now," Marla said, her tone turning professional in an instant. "Check in every 10, and don't go becoming a snowman on me." "No promises," Ethan replied, then clipped the radio back and pulled his hat down tighter over his ears. He zipped his heavy winter jacket up to his chin, checked that his flashlight and sidearm were in place more out of habit than fear, and stepped off the packed roadside into the deeper snow. It came up almost to his calves, the crust breaking with a soft crack around his boots. The cold seeped in, but his mind had already shifted into the clean, narrow focus that came with following signs. One foot after the other, eyes scanning ahead, noting the bend of a branch, the pattern of disturbed powder, the faint suggestion of a scuffle. The forest swallowed the sounds of the road behind him quickly. Inside the trees, the wind became a lower sound, more like breathing. The sky narrowed above to a river of pewter between the dark crowns of the pines. Ethan walked slowly, carefully. The tracks were fresher than the last snowfall, which meant whatever had happened here wasn't some old cruelty buried by time. The drag marks led him to a small clearing, a pocket of bare space ringed by trees, whose branches sagged under the weight of snow. At first he thought the thing against the far trunk was just another dark shadow, a fallen log or a tangle of brush. But then it moved, just enough for his attention to snap to it, every muscle tightening in the old instinctive way. What he saw knocked something loose in his chest. The dog was a German shepherd, though at first glance it looked almost like a piece of the night had been left behind in the snow. Its coat, once sleek, was now dull black, with a few faint charcoal tan smudges along the legs and underbelly, matted where frozen moisture had clumped the fur together. A rough rope hung slack around its neck. The fibers burned into the skin in a raw, angry groove that circled the throat like a cruel necklace. The rope was still tied loosely to a low branch on the tree, suggesting that whatever had happened here had ended in chaos. There were deep claw marks dug into the snow where the dog had strained, the ground scarred by the violence of its struggle. The animal stood unevenly, its legs trembling, sides heaving with shallow, quick breaths. It wasn't old. Ethan guessed maybe 3 or 4 years. In another life, with food and care, it would have been magnificent, all sharp lines and powerful muscle, the kind of dog that made you think of loyalty and long miles. Now, its ribs showed faintly under the thick coat, not enough to suggest starvation yet, but enough to show neglect. Its head was slightly lowered, ears tipped back, not flat in aggression, but tilted in wary confusion. Its most striking feature, even in that moment, were its eyes. A deep amber gold, the color of honey caught in late sunlight, now cloudy with fear and a kind of bewildered hurt that had nothing to do with the physical pain. At the base of the tree, half buried in the disturbed snow and pinned down by a small rock, was a crumpled scrap of paper. Ethan's jaw tightened as he stepped into the clearing, his boots sinking deep. The dog flinched, weight shifting as if it wanted to back away but had run out of room. It did not lunge. It did not bark. Its lips lifted just enough to show the suggestion of teeth, more in warning than threat, then settled again as its body shuddered. Ethan raised both hands slowly, palms open, the universal gesture of nothing in them, no harm, and kept his voice low, the way he used to talk to frightened recruits in hot tents far from home. "Easy there, buddy. he said, the words misting in front of him. "I see you. I'm not here to finish what someone started." The dog's gaze flicked to his face, held, then darted away again, as if eye contact hurt. Ethan crouched with the slow, deliberate care of a man who knew his knees would complain later and picked up the paper, keeping his movements as small as possible. The dog's body tensed once more, muscles bunching along its flanks, but it didn't move. The note had been scribbled in thick, impatient letters, the ink smeared where snow had dampened it. "Can't control," it read. "Dangerous. Abandon." 3 phrases, each like a small, blunt blow. Ethan stared at them for a heartbeat, then slipped the paper into an evidence bag from his pocket with fingers that felt heavier than they should. He took out his phone and snapped several photographs: the rope, the burned line in the dog's neck, the scattered snow, the boot prints leading away, the paw marks clustered like exclamation points around the tree. Procedure was a comfort. It meant this would be more than a sad story told over coffee. He keyed his radio again without taking his eyes off the dog. "Dispatch Unit 3. "Go ahead," Marla answered. "I've got an apparent animal cruelty scene in the woods off County 7, Ethan said, his voice carefully flat. "Adult German Shepherd, alive but injured. Rope burns around the neck, signs of struggle. I have a written note from the likely owner indicating abandonment. I'll need animal control and possibly a deputy to document. Send them to my marked unit. I'll guide them in from there." There was a pause, a tiny exhale from the other end, then Marla replied, "Copy. I'll notify animal control in the sheriff's office." "You all right out there, Ethan?" He swallowed once. "Yeah, dog's scared but holding. I'll stay with it until they arrive." 10-4. "I'll keep the channel clear for you." The forest settled again when the radio clicked off, the silence now full of Ethan's own pulse. He slowly shifted his weight, sinking to one knee in the snow, ignoring the icy wet that immediately seeped through his uniform pants. Lowering himself made him smaller, less threatening. He'd learned that, working with skittish soldiers, with kids on bad calls, with anyone who'd spent too long waiting for the next blow. The dog watched him, every line of its body wired tight. From this angle, Ethan could see a faint scar along its left flank, the fur there shorter and slightly whirled, an old injury that had healed, proof that this was not the first. Time life had swung hard. "They said you were dangerous, huh?" he murmured. "Funny. You look like the only one here who hasn't made a choice to be cruel." His fingers hovered a few inches above the snow, not reaching all the way to the animal. The dog's nose twitched, drawing in the scent of cold air, wet rope, and the human kneeling nearby. Its ears flicked at the sound of his voice, uncertain, caught between instinct and exhaustion. Ethan could see the slight tremor in its legs beginning to worsen. Adrenaline never lasted forever. Somewhere far off, a faint engine sound hinted that help might already be on the way. But here in this clearing, they were 2 souls suspended in the same frozen breath. "Here's the deal," Ethan said softly, as if explaining logistics before a mission. "Nobody's putting that rope tight around your neck again. Not while I'm standing here. You don't have to come to me, but I'm not leaving you alone in this snow." For a long moment, nothing happened. Snowflakes drifted lazily from a sky that couldn't decide if it wanted to storm or clear. The dog's amber eyes locked on his face once more, searching for the same thing Ethan had spent too many nights looking for in the mirror, some sign that he was not just another danger waiting to happen. The dog took a single tiny step forward, the rope trailing like a broken sentence. It didn't bridge the whole distance between them, but the space had shifted. Fear was still there, thick and sharp, but beside it, something else flickered, a tired, desperate kind of hope. Ethan held his breath, every muscle trained not to move too fast, not to reach too far. From a distance, if someone had been watching through the trees, it might have looked like 2 shadows facing each other in the snow. One tall, one four-legged, both a little worn at the edges, both unsure what came next. In the heart of the winter forest, with the wind whispering overhead and the snow reflecting what little light remained of the afternoon, they met each other there, not in trust, not yet, but in the fragile, trembling possibility of it. The next 30 minutes in the forest passed like slow breathing. The dog stood trembling but alive, and Ethan stood without moving, letting the cold bite into his knees until animal control finally arrived. The truck's headlights cut through the pines, and 2 figures emerged, bundled in thick winter coats. The first was Officer Henry Carver, mid-40s, with a lumberjack build, wide chest, thick arms, and a reddish beard he kept neatly trimmed. Henry had always been known as a fair man with a deep love for animals. He volunteered at the local shelter on weekends and had a talent for coaxing frightened creatures into trusting him. Beside him was Tessa Bloom, 26, petite and quick-moving, her long blonde hair braided beneath a wool hat. She was newly hired and still carried that earnest eagerness of someone who genuinely wanted to do good in the world. Tessa especially adored dogs and was the kind of person who called every animal sweetheart, even when they were snarling. They approached slowly, Henry keeping his voice low. "Good boy, easy there," while Tessa prepared a soft, wide-loop slip lead, designed to be gentle on injured animals. Shadow, as he would later be named, watched the newcomers with stiff wariness, tail down, ears tense. He clearly wanted to flee but had nowhere left to run. Ethan didn't move from his kneel, and when the dog's frightened gaze flicked back to him, Ethan murmured, "You're all right. They're here to help, not hurt." Henry nodded once to Ethan, silent professional acknowledgement, then carefully draped the slip lead around the dog's neck, avoiding the raw wound made by the rope. Shadow flinched but did not snap. That alone told everyone volumes. As they loaded the dog into the heated back compartment of the animal control truck, Ethan stood and flexed his frozen legs. He could feel blood rushing back in painful pins, but the discomfort barely registered against the weight in his chest. Henry glanced over. "You staying at the scene to finish pictures and measurements?" Ethan shook his head. "Already captured everything relevant. I'll follow you to the shelter. Want to make sure he gets checked in properly." Henry gave a faint half-smile. "Knew you would." The drive back into Ashen Hollow took place under a sky now thickening with new snow. Fat flakes drifted lazily at first, then multiplied until visibility dropped to little more than 30 feet. Street lamps blinked to life one by one, halos of gold against the falling white. The animal shelter sat near the south side of town, a low stone and timber building with a metal roof and a sign carved by hand. Ashen Hollow Animal Rescue and Care. Warm light spilled from its windows, glowing over the snowbanks like the promise of hearth and refuge. Inside, the air smelled of disinfectant, dry kibble, and something faintly comforting, like wool blankets and heat. Behind the front desk sat Sarah Milburn, 59, the shelter's manager. Sarah was tall and slender, with a posture that suggested both strength and fatigue, like someone who had spent decades caring for others without always remembering to care for herself. She wore thick glasses, a quilted cardigan, and a silver ring on a chain around her neck. Sarah had lost her husband 12 years earlier to a heart attack. Since then, she had poured all her nurturance into animals and into being the quiet backbone of the shelter. She had a firm moral conviction that animals, like people, could be hurt by cruelty, but also healed by love. When she saw Henry escorting the injured dog inside, her expression softened, but her eyes sharpened. A professional and emotional response combined. "Let's get him to exam stall 3, she said. The stall was a heated kennel room with padded floor mats and thick blankets. Shadow trembled as he stepped inside, and when the door clicked shut, he circled once, then sank onto the bedding, exhausted beyond resistance. Sarah approached him slowly and respectfully. "Poor soul," she murmured, and even though her voice was gentle, it carried a steady authority. "We'll take care of you now." She examined the wound with practiced precision. The rope burn was bad but not infected. With treatment, it would heal. While Henry documented the intake form, Ethan filled out the cruelty incident report and attached the evidence photos. Legally, the dog had to remain under shelter custody for a mandatory holding period, while attempts to identify an owner were made, even if the evidence already suggested the previous owner had deliberately abandoned him. Tessa crouched beside the kennel bars, whispering comments under her breath. "You're safe now. You're okay. Beautiful boy." Shadow did not approach, but didn't growl either. He simply watched her, pupils wide, breathing shallow. That look, the look of suspicion balanced against a fragile need for connection, struck Ethan deep. He stayed longer than necessary, lingering while Henry and Tessa finished paperwork and Sarah uploaded records. The snowstorm outside intensified. Through the windows, flakes swirled sideways like white handwriting across the night. Eventually, Henry clapped Ethan gently on the shoulder. "Go home. You look like you're thawing after standing in a freezer." Ethan hesitated. His gaze drifted to the dark dog curled in the kennel. Shadow lifted his head a fraction, just enough for their eyes to meet. Something electric and wordless passed between them. Not gratitude, not yet, but recognition. A recognition Ethan hadn't felt in years. That night, back in his modest cabin on the hillside, Ethan couldn't sleep. He lay awake listening to the stove crackling, and his mind ran circles. He remembered the haunted amber eyes, the quiver in the legs, the note, the rope, the resignation. No, not resignation. The endurance. Like the dog had expected nothing but hurt, yet still chose to live. He knew that feeling intimately. The next day after shift, he returned to the shelter. And the next day. And the next. Shadow slowly began recognizing his footsteps. In the corridor, he would lift his head before anyone else's. At first, the dog stayed back against the far wall of the kennel, but gradually, day by day, he stopped flinching when Ethan approached. Sometimes Ethan spoke aloud. Other times, he simply sat on the floor outside the kennel, leaning back against the opposite wall, breathing in quiet companionship. Their relationship formed not through dramatic breakthroughs, but through accumulated silence. Sarah noticed. One evening, she caught Ethan lingering by the kennel, long past visiting hours. She folded her arms and gave him a look of gentle amusement. "You know," she said, "dogs don't choose lightly who they trust. If he's letting you sit there, it means something." Ethan looked up. "He's been hurt enough. I'm just trying not to be another bad memory." Sarah nodded. "You're not." 3 days passed, then 5, then 7. During that time, they attempted to trace ownership. No microchip record, no veterinary history locally, no response to public notice. But by the 8th day, Sarah and Ethan both suspected the truth. Whoever had owned him before had intended to dispose of him permanently. The formal paperwork was then prepared to classify the dog as legally abandoned and eligible for adoption. Ethan stared at the document like a man confronting a cliff he already knew he would jump from. When Sarah asked quietly, "Are you sure you want to do this?" Ethan nodded once, the movement steady as oath. "Yes." He signed his name. He gave the dog a name, Shadow, because he had followed someone through the darkest part of the forest and still come out alive. That night, when the kennel door opened for the first time outside of examinations, Shadow stepped out on trembling paws, looked up at Ethan, and allowed the leash to be clipped to his collar. He walked beside Ethan, not confidently, not joyfully, but willingly, and that was enough. Together they left the shelter and stepped out into the swirling, softly falling snow of Ashen Hollow, two shapes moving forward into an uncertain future that, for the first time, belonged to them both. Shadow's first night in Ethan's cabin unfolded like an awkward duet between two souls trying not to disturb each other. The cabin itself sat halfway up a snowy embankment, flanked by tall lodgepole pines that whistled and murmured when the winter wind passed through. It was not a large house, a single-story structure of pine wood with a front porch buried under snowdrifts and a metal chimney that continuously breathed thin white smoke. Inside, the air always carried the smell of cedar, wool blankets, and coffee grounds. Shadow walked in with cautious, halting steps. Ethan opened the door gently, letting the dog enter on his own terms. The German shepherd sniffed the threshold, the rug, the air. Every tiny sound, the creak of floorboards, the crackle of the iron stove, made him flinch. Ethan didn't comment. He simply moved with deliberate softness, a man who had long ago learned how to navigate silence. He took off his boots, placed them to the side, hung up his coat, then looked down to Shadow with a softened expression. "You're home," he said. Shadow did not immediately believe that statement. He paced in small circles, then retreated to a far corner near a bookshelf. That corner, between a stack of old newspapers and a crate of firewood, became his territory for the night. Ethan noted it quietly. Later, when he boiled water for tea, the whistle of the kettle sent Shadow crashing back against the wall with a startled yelp. Immediately, Ethan set the kettle down, knelt, and whispered, "It's just steam. Nothing's going to hurt you here." The reassurance wasn't grand, wasn't cinematic, but it was patient, and that patience was a kind of balm. In the morning, with weak winter sunlight filtering through frosted windows, Ethan decided Shadow would need a professional examination beyond the initial shelter intake. That meant one destination: the veterinary office of Dr. Miriam Willis. Dr. Willis was 52 and carried an air of seasoned gentleness, like someone who had seen far too many fragile creatures and never once raised her voice at any of them. She wore simple, earthy clothes, wool sweater under a heavy brown coat, and her hair, a long curtain of silver gray, was tied back in a horsetail. The lines around her eyes were etched by decades of smiling kindly and squinting at small injuries. She had lost her younger sister in a car accident when she was 18, and since then she had always gravitated toward healing beings who could not speak for themselves. That shaping wound of her youth translated into kindness that was steady, firm, and deeply intuitive. When Ethan entered the clinic with Shadow, Dr. Willis was already rolling up her sleeves. "Well now," she said in a voice like warm cloth, "let's take a good look at you, dark traveler." Shadow bristled at the examination table, but stayed close to Ethan. He tried to pull away once when a metal instrument clinked, ears flattening, tail tucked. Dr. Willis did not force him. She waited, laid the tool aside, and sat down on the floor with him instead. Slowly, gracefully, at his height. She examined the rope burn gently, murmuring, "These scars weren't made in one day. Some of these have old tissue. He's been mishandled repeatedly." Shadow looked up at her, not fully trusting, not fully distrusting, just seeing something different, an adult human without aggression. While they talked, another appointment arrived. Caleb Rowan, 11 years old, carrying a ginger barn cat in a flannel-lined carrier. Caleb had a mop of brown curls, freckles across his nose, and an ever-present glow of curiosity. His personality was fearless in some ways. A boy who climbed trees, who biked too fast, but gentle with animals. He came from a difficult situation. His father had died of heart failure when Caleb was 6. Since then, he had lived with his mother, Julie, and he developed a habit of trying to protect smaller creatures the way he wished someone had protected his father. The boy immediately noticed Shadow. How could he not? "That's a German shepherd," Caleb breathed. "Is he yours?" "Just recently," Ethan answered. "His name's Shadow." "Can I—" Caleb began, stepping forward excitedly. But before his hand could reach, Dr. Willis raised one finger gently, not scolding, just guiding. "Let the dog choose, dear." Caleb understood at once. He knelt, arm at his side, palm open, not pushing into Shadow's space, just offering. Shadow froze, studied the boy. A tiny tremor went through his frame. Then he inched forward, just enough to lower his nose and sniff Caleb's fingers. Caleb's eyes lit up, and he whispered, "Hi, Shadow," like greeting a wounded knight. A small lick. Just one. Then Shadow backed away. But the gesture, it was monumental. If this were a film, the camera would slow, music would rise like a hush of winter bells, and the moment would hang, delicate, profound. Dr. Willis quietly smiled. Ethan quietly exhaled. Caleb quietly beamed. Shadow quietly endured and began, slowly, to trust. After the appointment, Ethan took Shadow home. The dog seemed a bit lighter, not physically, but in the cautious way he walked. That night, as snow slid from the roof with a rushing hiss, Shadow startled again. But this time, his eyes went not to the door, not to the corner, but to Ethan. And Ethan whispered, "You're safe, Shadow." And miraculously, Shadow believed him just enough to stay where he was. Later, Ethan was awakened by the familiar rush of a nightmare, one of those nights where the past slammed into his mind like a door breaking open. His breathing ran ragged, his hands half curled into fists. And in the dark, Shadow rose from his corner, not touching him, not intruding, but lying beside the bed, close enough for Ethan to reach out if he needed contact. When Ethan's shaking hand absently lowered and rested on Shadow's shoulder, the trembling began to ease. Outside, the ashen hollow wind sang against the chimney, and the storm creaked at window frames. But inside that cabin, for the first time in many, many years, two souls slept with something resembling peace. Winter in Ashen Hollow had a way of sharpening both beauty and danger into the same blade. On some afternoons, the sunlight glinted off the hard-packed snow so brilliantly that it looked like the earth itself had been coated in diamond dust. On others, the more common ones, the sky lay heavy and dull, matching the color of steel wool, and the snow crusted into slick, invisible sheets of ice that could snatch a careless foot or a careless tire. On one such afternoon, Ethan finished his shift early and decided to do something simple and almost ordinary. Take Shadow on a walk around the town park. Shadow wore a padded winter harness to protect the healing skin at his neck and had begun to walk with the tentative self-assurance of a creature slowly rediscovering autonomy. His gait was smoother than weeks before, though he still flinched at sudden noises, like a passing truck or a slamming door. The park stretched beside the elementary school, with big wooden benches and metal swing frames now half buried in snowbanks. Children, wrapped in exploding layers of scarves and mittens, were out playing during the last half hour before dinner time. Their laughter rang out bright and high, each sound like a bell struck in clear, cold air. Shadow's ears swiveled at the sounds, not in alarm now, but curiosity. He had learned that not all human noise meant harm. Some of it meant joy. Among the children was Caleb Rowan, the 11-year-old boy with brown curls and a face full of freckles, a child whose energy rarely dimmed even in bitter cold. Today he was playing a fast, slippery game of kickball with neighborhood kids. His mother, Julie, 38, sturdy, brown-haired, with the gentle, watchful weariness of a single parent, stood nearby holding a thermos of cocoa and rubbing her gloved hands for warmth. Julie had always carried a kind of invisible fear lodged under her ribs, a fear built from losing her husband too young and raising her son alone. Moments of danger, no matter how small, hit her faster and harder than they did other parents. She doted gently on Caleb, urged caution often, but also understood he needed to run, to play, to grow. Ethan gave her a friendly nod as he passed. She smiled back, cheeks flushed pink from cold. "Shadow seems much more at ease lately," she observed. "A little," Ethan replied. "He's learning to trust." Julie glanced at the dog kindly. "I'm glad he found you, or you found him." "Maybe both," Ethan said. Caleb waved. "Hi, Shadow." Shadow's tail gave one faint wag, a miracle of its own kind. The sun dipped lower, and the wind shifted. A small orange ball bounced off a snowbank and skittered across the icy surface of the road beside the park, and Caleb ran after it. 11-year-olds believed themselves born with immunity to harm. The world still felt padded to them, forgiving. Caleb sprinted out, boots slipping, eyes only on the ball. Ethan saw the movement from the corner of his vision, saw the road, saw the speeding delivery truck turning the corner. He shouted, voice tearing through the cold air. "Caleb, stop!" But warnings travel slower than wheels. The truck driver, panicking, slammed the brakes, but on ice. Brakes turned traitor. The vehicle skidded sideways, tires screaming a muted rubber cry against frozen pavement. Caleb froze halfway into the road, caught between instinct to run forward or back. Shadow did neither. The German shepherd, who once cringed away from every sharp sound, launched forward with explosive speed. If Ethan had blinked, he would have missed it. The leash yanked through his gloved hand, burning friction trailing behind. Shadow's body hit Caleb sideways, not violently, but with just enough force to knock the boy into the snowbank beside the road. The truck slid through the exact space where Caleb had been standing, missing him by mere inches, but it scraped so close to Shadow's hind legs that snow and slush sprayed up against the dog's coat. The vehicle finally skidded to a halt, hissing steam. Silence crashed over the scene. Caleb, wide-eyed and panting, looked up from the snow, his palms scraped bloody, his knees bruised, but alive. Julie's scream tore through that silence, raw, primal, maternal. She sprinted to her son, grabbed him, clutched him against her chest as if her arms alone could anchor him to existence. Caleb stammered, "Mom, Mom, Shadow, he saved me." Julie turned then, still holding her son, eyes landing on Shadow. The dog shook once, like flinging off snow, and looked at Caleb, not at anyone else, only the boy. Ethan reached him seconds later, dropping to one knee, checking pause, checking movement. "He's okay," Ethan breathed. He's okay. Inner relief hit him like a punch. Then the reactions began to ripple. Two older residents, Mr. and Mrs. Ellison, walked over. They had seen Shadow weeks ago through the lens of rumor. The abandoned, dangerous dog. Now they saw him through the lens of action. The dog that saved a child. Mrs. Ellison's voice trembled. He pushed the boy clear. Mr. Ellison nodded. That wasn't attack. That was protection. Other townsfolk added their witness. The dog reacted faster than any of us. He didn't bite. He shielded. He risked his life. Even the truck driver stumbled out, shaken pale. He just flew at him, pushed him aside, like he knew. Julie knelt before Shadow, still holding Caleb. Her voice broke, softened. Thank you, brave boy. Shadow did not understand English gratitude, but he understood tone. He understood softness. He understood tears no longer felt like threats. He lowered his ears, not in fear, but in humility. That evening, when Ethan and Shadow walked back home through streets turning indigo with dusk, Ethan didn't speak at first. Then, he said quietly, "You didn't hesitate, not even a second." Shadow's only answer was a gentle bump of his shoulder against Ethan's thigh. Not an accidental brush, but a chosen one. Inside the cabin, Ethan knelt beside him and brushed melting snow from his fur. "You're not a burden," he murmured. "You're not a danger. Not anymore. Not ever again." And Shadow, for the first time, allowed Ethan to lift his chin and hold his gaze, without looking away. The story of Shadow's act, his fearless push that saved Caleb from the oncoming truck, spread through Ashen Hollow like fire carried on winter wind. The photos, the eyewitness accounts, the story of the once-abandoned dog who saved a child. It all moved swiftly across social circles, local Facebook groups, even the town bulletin at the grocery store. People who had once crossed the street to avoid Shadow now stopped Ethan in public just to ask how the dog was healing, how he was adjusting, how he was recovering from his past. And each time, Ethan would answer with a quiet, honest pride. He's doing better every day. But good news, paradoxically, sometimes stirs old shadows. 5 days after the incident, Ethan stood at his cabin doorway pulling on his patrol jacket when he saw a figure trudging up his snow-covered driveway. The wind blew thin layers of powdered white around the man's boots, swirling flakes around his ankles like restless spirits. Even before he could make out the face, Ethan recognized the posture, a swaggering, slightly unstable gait, like someone stepping forward mainly because anger was pushing them from behind. Randall Briggs, the former owner. Randall was 44 but looked older, weathered by alcohol, resentment, and years of mishandled responsibility. His coat was frayed, hanging crookedly over a body that had gone a little to seed. His hair, once a strong brown, had thinned and tangled under a worn cap. His eyes were bloodshot, not from crying, but from substance-driven restlessness. He was a man who had once owned Shadow, but never truly cared for him. Ethan stepped outside, closing the cabin door firmly behind him. Shadow, somewhere inside, let out a low, uncertain rumble, not aggression, but recognition. Randall stopped a few paces from the porch. His words came out almost as a growl. "That's my dog!" Ethan spoke levelly. "Not anymore." Randall pulled a crumpled photo from his pocket, an old image of Shadow when he was younger, healthier, wearing a collar in a yard that looked different from the forest where he was found. "He belonged to me," Randall insisted. "You can't just steal a man's dog." The hypocrisy of that statement was so sharp, Ethan nearly laughed, but didn't. He kept his face steel quiet. "You abandoned him," Ethan said. "You tied a rope around his neck. You left a note saying, 'Dangerous, abandon.' The law recognized it as relinquishment." Randall's jaw tightened. "I was training him. He's uncontrollable. He's vicious. You don't know." Ethan's eyes flashed with something hot, but controlled. "I know he saved a child's life. I know he avoids aggression. I know he trembles when someone raises their voice." Randall took a hostile step closer. Ethan's hand stayed calmly near his radio, not his gun. "You had no right to take him," Randall spat. "With all this publicity, people talking, he's Valuable now. A heroic dog. Newspapers would pay. People would want him. I could. And that was it. That was the moment Ethan truly understood the truth. Randall didn't want Shadow out of love. He wanted him out of pride, control, and selfish benefit. Before Ethan could reply, the sound of a truck pulling up crunched through the snow. Sheriff Dalton Pierce and Deputy Marie Hale stepped out. Sheriff Dalton was a tall, stern-eyed man in his 50s, a figure carved from the old laws of Montana, practical, steady, and unimpressed by theatrics. He wore his uniform like iron armor against foolishness. Deputy Marie Hale, 33, short dark hair, sharp gaze, was the epitome of calm. She had once worked animal cruelty cases in Helena before relocating to a quieter town, or so she had hoped. Dalton's voice rumbled through the cold air. "Mr. Briggs, step back." Randall stiffened. "This isn't police business. This is between me and that dog thief." Marie spoke gently but firmly. "Actually, it is police business. We have your note. We have photos of the rope injuries. We have statements from neighbors who saw you mistreat that dog." Randall's face flushed a dark, unhealthy red. "They're lying. I never—" Dalton opened a folder. In it were Ethan's photographs of the rope burns, the written note left at the tree, Dr. Willis's veterinary injury assessment, witness statements, most notably from Mr. Tom Garner, the older rancher who had seen Randall dragging the dog through the snow weeks before. Dalton read aloud slowly, cold as iron. "Dog is dangerous, cannot control, abandon. Handwritten and signed by you at the bottom. You gave up legal ownership of that animal." Randall's eyes darted desperately. That wasn't signing away ownership. It was just frustration. Marie tilted her head. "You also left him tied to a tree with intent to abandon him. That's a felony offense under state law." Sheriff Dalton stepped forward and produced handcuffs. "You're being taken in for investigation of animal cruelty, reckless endangerment, and harassment." Randall lunged, not physically at Ethan, but lunged with words sharpened by entitlement. "You'll pay for this. You all think the mutt is a hero, but I made him strong. Dalton cut in. "Enough." The cuffs clicked shut. The sound was final. As Randall was escorted to the patrol truck, Shadow, inside the cabin, pressed against the window to watch. His ears were raised, tail stiff. Not fearful this time, but alert. His amber eyes tracked the man who had once treated him like property. And for the first time, Shadow did not tremble. As the truck pulled away, Ethan opened the door. Shadow approached him slowly, sniffed the air where Randall had stood. Then he rested his head gently against Ethan's leg, not asking if the danger was gone, but confirming that he knew where safety lived now. Ethan stroked him behind the ear. "It's over," he whispered. "You're never going back to him." Shadow exhaled, a long, slow, releasing breath. If a soul can shed weight, his did. That night, Ethan wrote in his small leather journal, "Today, the law finally protected the right life. Today, Shadow was not just defended, he was chosen by justice." Outside, snow continued falling, soft, silent, pure, like a benediction over Ashen Hollow. The winter deepened, and though Ashen Hollow remained wrapped in snow, something had changed, not in the weather, but in the emotional temperature of the town and the home on the hillside where Ethan and Shadow now lived. The cabin, once merely shelter, now felt more like shared territory, a space where two wounded beings were slowly relearning how to exist in the world with less fear and more hope. On mornings when Ethan stirred awake from tangled dreams, he now found Shadow lying near, but not pressed against, the bed. The dog had learned that closeness could be offered without intrusion. Some mornings, if Ethan woke shaking or breathing too fast, Shadow would move incrementally closer until Ethan's hand found him. Then they would breathe themselves back into equilibrium. But this chapter of their life unfolded beyond the cabin walls. Ethan had begun attending sessions at the Ashen Hollow Veterans Support Center, a modest red brick building near the courthouse with a sign that read, "Hope After Service." It was run largely by volunteers and funded by small donations. Inside were reading rooms, coffee pots that never emptied, and a collection of mismatched chairs arranged in friendly semicircles. The director of the center, Marion Mack Landers, age 61, was a retired Marine Corps lieutenant colonel. Mac was lean and wiry, tall with a stiff bearing that never entirely left him even after decades away from field command. He was a man of few wasted words, but the words he did speak had weight. He wore a faded green jacket with a small U.S. Marines pin and had a habit of pressing 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose whenever thinking deeply. One of those small human gestures born of years in hard places. Mac had heard about Shadow's rescue of Caleb and had, out of curiosity, invited Ethan and his dog to drop by the center one afternoon. What started as a simple social visit quickly became something larger. Shadow followed Ethan into the building at a relaxed trot, pausing occasionally to sniff new corners, but not flattening himself against walls the way he once did. He walked, not like a servant or a victim, but like a creature cautiously embracing freedom. There were several veterans already inside. Logan Pierce, age 24, pale and withdrawn, who had served in Afghanistan and carried a kind of heavy silence inside him. Arthur Lang, age 73, an elderly Vietnam veteran with arthritis and a tendency to sit with his hands folded over a cane. Brian Keller, 39, energetic but visibly unsettled, prone to tapping his foot rapidly when anxious Shadow paused before each of them, not seeking affection, but offering presence. Logan was the first to break. In an earlier chapter of his existence, he would have avoided animals entirely for fear of unpredictability. But that afternoon, he simply sat, head bowed, while Shadow settled himself near the young veteran's boots. Logan hesitated, hand trembling slightly, then rested it against Shadow's back. No words, just contact. The tremor eased. Seeing this, Mac approached Ethan. "You know," he said, "some dogs aren't just companions. Some become conduits, quiet ones." Ethan didn't answer. He only looked at Shadow, the calm, alert way the dog simply stayed. A week later, Mac filed paperwork with the Veterans Association and the County Council to designate Shadow as a therapy-assisted support participant, not as a certified service animal, not yet, but as an unofficial morale asset. Ethan began bringing Shadow to the center twice a week. During group discussions, Shadow would lay on the floor between the chairs, tilting his head periodically at a voice change or moving to place himself near whichever veteran seemed most distressed that day. At home, life also changed in quieter ways. Ethan had once been a man who lived inside himself, talking to no one except his radio and the wind. But now Shadow served as a kind of social bridge. When neighbors walked their dogs past the cabin, Ethan sometimes stepped outside to chat. When Julie Rowan or Caleb came by with cookies or warm bread, Ethan invited them in for coffee or cocoa. Caleb especially liked to sit on the rug beside Shadow and read aloud from adventure stories, fantasy tales, or biographies of explorers. Shadow listened with his chin on his paws and his eyes tilted toward the boy, not for plot comprehension, but for companionship. Sometimes Caleb would laugh at a part of the story, and Shadow's ears would perk, as though catching humor like motion in the snow. Meanwhile, Dr. Miriam Willis continued to check in on Shadow's healing progress. The rope scar at his neck had faded to a faint line beneath the fur. Miriam had suggested topical ointments and gentle stretching to help the dog regain full motion and confidence. "You know," she told Ethan during one visit, "this dog is remarkable not because he survived, but because he didn't let survival turn into aggression. Many animals respond to pain with defensiveness. Shadow responds with discernment. He chooses when to trust." Ethan nodded. "He's teaching me the same." One night, after a long day at work and an evening volunteer visit at the center, Ethan returned to the cabin and found himself standing at the window, looking out over the town. The snow reflected the moonlight in velvet gradients, making Ashen Hollow look like a quilt stitched from silver and frost. Shadow stood quietly beside him, tail swaying gently. Ethan whispered, a confession without audience. "I thought I was done. I thought I was supposed to just fade into quiet. But you gave me direction again." Shadow didn't respond with a bark or a whine, just a steady, grounding presence. In the days that followed, something else shifted. Ethan began sleeping through entire nights. Some mornings, he woke without memory of nightmares. On those mornings, he found Shadow curled nearby, eyes half open, as if guarding the perimeter of Ethan's mind. At the center, Logan Pierce began speaking again. First a sentence or two, then more. One afternoon, he even laughed, a startled, embarrassed laugh, like someone hearing their own voice after a long silence. He scratched Shadow behind the ear and said, "You're the first thing that's made me feel safe in a long time." Ethan overheard that, and later, in the privacy of his cabin, he wrote in his journal, "He protects the wounded, human and canine alike, not by force, by presence." By the end of February, people in Ashen Hollow did not refer to Shadow as the stray or the rescue dog anymore. They called him the veteran's dog, the boy's guardian, the town's quiet hero. And sometimes, just Shadow, spoken with respect, fondness, and gratitude. But the truest title belonged to no human tongue. It existed only in the silent bond between Ethan and the dog who had once been thrown away. On a cold sunset day, standing atop the snowy ridge behind the cabin, Ethan looked down at the town, breathing deeply, and Shadow stood at his side, their two silhouettes stretched across the white earth. They were no longer lost souls wandering. They were two survivors walking forward, not into fear, not into memory, but into a life that finally belonged to both of them. In the quiet closing of this story, we are reminded that God's miracles often arrive gently, not with thunder or bright signs, but through the loyalty of a dog who refused to retreat into fear, and through the healing presence God places inside those who care for the broken. In our everyday lives, we all face storms of doubt, loneliness, or heavy memories. Yet God walks beside us even then, guiding us toward unexpected blessings, second chances, and people who help us breathe again. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need encouragement today. Leave a comment to tell us your thoughts, and type Amen if you believe in the quiet miracles God sends. And please remember to support the channel by pressing subscribe so we can continue bringing stories of faith, hope, and gentle redemption. May God bless you and your loved ones with peace, protection, and strength.